Our next guest is going to discuss the administration's first term by putting this American moment in context. We'll discuss democracy, the state of the office of the president, and our future. We're excited to be joined by Michael Beschloss. Michael is a presidential historian for NBC News and PBS NewsHour, a columnist for the New York Times, and the author of 9 books on the history of the presidency in America. Michael, thank you so much for joining us.
I think this is an election of a kind that we have not seen before in American history. I know a lot of people oftentimes say that this is the most important election of our lifetime, but I think it really is. And if you had to go back in history for examples of other elections of this kind of importance where we were really at a crossroads, I would go back to 1860 when the country was deciding whether to elect Abraham Lincoln or not, but really deciding whether it would try to remain half slave or half free, and the result of that election was a civil war. Or 1940, a year in which Franklin Roosevelt was campaigning saying, I hope we can stay out of war against the Nazis and the Imperial Japanese, but I'm not sure that we can. And in order to try to stay out, I'm going to build 50,000 planes and try to beef up our defense. And his opponent, Wendell Willkie, was saying, elect Roosevelt, you'll be in a war almost immediately after Election Day. And some Republicans were saying, vote for Willkie so that Roosevelt doesn't bring you a war that will, if you can believe it, this was actually said, that will plow under every 4th American boy. That was the decibel level. So what does that have in common with this year? I would say a number of things are at stake in a way that is way above partisanship. Number one, we've got a pandemic of a kind that we have not seen in 100 years. The duty of our government and our president is to keep us safe. They haven't managed to do it. So in voting this fall, we're casting a ballot that will have a lot to do with whether Americans live or die. Number two, we're in one of the most difficult economic situations of the last century. The 2 candidates for president and others at lower levels have different views on what we should do. Number 3, look at this last summer. We now realize, I think many people more than they did before, how deep the problems of racial justice are in this country and how much they remain to be addressed. But above and beyond everything else, I think is the question of democracy. And this is not a political comment. I'm not giving an opinion on healthcare or another political issue, but Donald Trump during the last 4 years has had certain strengths, but one of them is not a deep understanding or reverence for democracy. He's tried almost consistently to expand the power of the presidency, to break down the power of Congress, to some extent subdue the Supreme Court, and also subdue other institutions that are checks on the power of a president and government, like the media. So as rarely before in American history, those questions are at stake this fall as well. We've seen a big growth in presidential power over the last 4 years. And I've studied the presidency all of my life, and I have always been worried about presidents getting too powerful, getting us involved in unnecessary wars, sometimes not telling the American people the truth, and also in some cases posing a danger to our liberties. And one thing, whether you like Donald Trump or don't like Donald Trump, you would have to say about the last 4 years, this is a president who has been very serious about trying to expand presidential power as much as possible. When he says, I've given powers under the Constitution that are so enormous that I don't even talk about them, that's the kind of language that we've never seen from a president before in American history. I hope this is not a danger. I hope our democracy is permanent, but remember what the founders in Philadelphia embraced, which was the idea, eternal vigilance is always the price of liberty. The great men and women who were in Philadelphia in 1787 knew that they could write a constitution. They hoped that ours would always be a government of laws and not of men, we would now say of human beings. But they also knew that they were writing a constitution that gave an enormous amount of power to those who serve as president, those who serve in Congress, and in other roles. It depends very much on making sure that you've got people in those jobs who do the right thing. And we've heard a lot the last 4 years about democratic norms, which I think is a little bit of too much of a social science term. All it really means is customs that we've all abided by as a way of showing our respect for democracy. And one of those customs has been that presidents have generally avoided letting the White House get too partisan. So when we see signs that a custom like that is abandoned, it makes me nervous for democracy. It makes me want to sleep sometimes with one eye open, because this summer we saw a situation where a Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, gave a political speech at a party convention. Virtually he did it because of the pandemic. That's something that we do not normally see. We saw a president give an extremely partisan address to a meeting of the Republican National Convention on the White House lawn. We've never seen anything like that before either. There's nothing against the law about it, but it does suggest a president who is very willing to shatter certain democratic traditions. So all I'm saying is that when you see, for instance, President Trump, as he did after his illness, and I think all of us are glad that he's feeling better, but give a speech from the rear balcony of the White House that is partisan to a political group that was, in this case, brought in to resemble a Trump rally at an airport, that's something that other presidents have not done, because they felt that the White House should be a symbol of all of us and above politics. So if you are someone who is nervous about the future of democracy, pay attention to these little signs and make sure that they do not pass you by. We've got a wonderful Constitution drafted in Philadelphia, but in the end, it depends on human beings carrying out those democratic ideals. And one of the ways they do that is to show respect for democratic institutions. One of those institutions is the press. Every president hates the press. Every president thinks that people who are writing in newspapers or talking on television are saying things that are wrong and unfair and maybe even unpatriotic. But every president, including John Kennedy when he was angry at criticism over the Bay of Pigs, or George W. Bush when he was angry about what people were saying against the Iraq War, they all said that a free press is a basic element of a democratic society. Jefferson said, I would rather have a press without a government than a government without a press, because without that, you don't have a monitoring mechanism to make sure that the government does not take too many of our liberties. Anyone who has been unsettled by the last 4 years, some of the effort to freeze the press out, ignore the president's and the government's obligation to provide information to the public, should find that a little bit unnerving. All of us, I and all of us who are listening to the sound of my voice, we all have the most important role in American society, and that's the role of citizen. We vote, we get involved, and especially we watch very warily to make sure that none of our leaders tries to take too much power. And that has happened all through the history of the presidency. Presidents at times want to take on too much power. They get into fights with Congress. They take us into wars that are unnecessary. They do other things that our founders originally did not hope that they would do, because George Washington, for example, thought that the presidency would be a pretty modest office. But look at the last few years. We've seen a president who has used the Department of Justice in ways that we had not seen before, interfered with the idea of an independent Department of Justice. Anyone who was watching last summer, who saw Lafayette Square in Washington, D.C., and some of the other things that happened at the time of the turbulence, you saw a president trying to use the military in a way that presidents have not done before to get involved in domestic affairs, to the point that we saw something that we haven't seen before, which is a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff going on television to apologize for having followed the president's orders to do things that, on reconsideration, he felt that no chairman of the Joint Chiefs should be doing. And this also goes for use of the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI and our intelligence agencies. I hope this does not mean that democracy is endangered, but it is always the duty of all of us citizens to watch all of this extremely carefully and make sure that democracy is not endangered. And the way we do that above all, of course, is to vote. I'm not an easily alarmed person, but I heard President Trump last summer talk about delaying the 2020 election. No president has ever remotely thought of doing such a thing. Not Lincoln during the Civil War, not Franklin Roosevelt during World War II. Roosevelt in 1944, actually some people said, you know, we're in a world war for our survival. Maybe we should delay the election a year because we can't go through this at a time that, you know, we have so many Americans fighting all around the world. And Roosevelt said this is exactly the time that we should be doing this as normal, because we are setting an example for the rest of the world how a democracy operates in crisis. You've seen the president a couple of times saying, you know, maybe I deserve a third term or a fourth term, and the usual constitutional restrictions should not apply to me. Later on, in most cases, he said, I was joking, but we're living in a very different time. In 1989, George H.W. Bush was inaugurated, and in his inaugural address, he said, the day of the dictator is over. That was true in 1989. That was the year that all those revolutions occurred in Europe, where authoritarian dictatorships backed by the Soviet Union came down. The Soviet Union itself was beginning to expire. We are now living in a very different world, and when you hear a president joking about things like that or saying that he's joking, take him seriously. Every president shatters historical norms. There is no rule book. What you hope to do is elect a president of the United States who has a sense of history and a love of democracy and an understanding of the fact that we give our presidents an extreme amount of power, especially in the nuclear age. In exchange for that, we citizens demand from that president that that power be used with restraint. I don't think we have had any precedent for the kind of lack of restraint we've seen in the last 4 years. I sometimes think, you know, what might historians say about the 2020 election, however it turns out within the next month, we hope. And one thing there is, it always depends on what happens to this country. You know, I remember what Ronald Reagan said at the Republican convention in 1976. He was saying that he had participated in the burying of a time capsule that would be opened far into the future. And he was wondering what future generations would say of American democracy. And he said that there were basically two scenarios. One, they would know whether American democracy had survived or not. And number two, if our freedom had not survived, no one in the future would be allowed to know about that. And I hate to sound so draconian, but we have some of the same echoes as we approach the election of 2020. Where does democracy go from here? It depends on all of us. And anyone who loves American history, which includes me, and I'll bet includes all of you listening, you have to be an optimist. Look at all the things that we've gone through over the last 2 centuries and more, these crises, these wars, these economic calamities, you know, even pandemics. You know, Philadelphia used to close down and people would have to leave because there would be waves of yellow fever, as most of you know. Somehow we get through it, and there's something in the American DNA that allows us to surmount the crisis that we're in. So for anyone who's alarmed by what we're living through in 2020, I would say westward look, the land is bright.